State troopers waited at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7, 1965. John Lewis felt his skull shatter under the impact of a heavy, state-issued billy club. But the ultimate resistance to this state-sponsored terror arrived in television cameras documented the carnage for a horrified nation, while medical volunteers wait. One survivor now provides the definitive account of her efforts to save the lives of those traveling the long road to Montgomery. June Dobbs Butts, a volunteer nurse, stood near the foot of the bridge as the line of 600 marchers, led by Hosea Williams. The Alabama sun was bright, but the atmosphere was chillingly cold. Across the bridge stood a phalanx of Alabama state troopers in blue uniforms and gas masks, backed by Sheriff Jim. When the order to disperse was met with a prayerful silence, the clouds of yellow CN and CS gas rolled across the pavement, choking the lungs of those who only sought the right to vote. June saw the terror in their eyes, the frantic, blinded stumbling of men and women who couldn't see the clubs descending upon them. She watched as John Lewis, the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, collapsed under a blow that fractured his skull. The peace of a Sunday afternoon was replaced by the screams of the wounded and the rhythmic, terrifying thud of horses' hooves. For the medical volunteers of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, this wasn't just a political demonstration anymore. Roughly 17 marchers were hospitalized, and over 50 others were left with bone fractures and severe chemical burns. June and her colleagues rushed forward into the haze, armed only with gauze, saline to flush burning eyes, and a profound sense of duty. They transformed the nearby Brown Chapel A.M.E. church, the movement's citadel of resistance, into a frantic triage center. Its wooden pews became hospital beds where nurses spent the long night washing the sting of the state's hatred from the faces of the broken and the brave. This was the moment the long road to Montgomery truly began, paved with the iron-willed courage of medical professionals who refused to let the movement bleed out in the shadows of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Inside the sanctuary of Brown Chapel A.M.E. Church, the air was thick with a mixture of floor wax, old hymnals, and the sudden clinical sting of antiseptic. This twin-towered brick edifice, known to the local community as the Citadel of Resistance, had become more than a house of worship. It was now a field hospital on the front lines of a domestic war. As the wounded retreated from the bridge on that terrifying Sunday, they were met by a new kind of soldier, the volunteers of the Medical Committee for Human Rights. Formed just a year earlier during the heat of the 1964 Freedom Summer, the MCHR arrived in Selma with a specific radical mandate to provide a medical presence that served as both a lifeline for the injured and a silent professional witness against. Dr. John L.S. Holloman, Jr., the MCHR chairman, and Dr. Alvin Poussin, the Southern Field Director, understood that in the eyes of the world, a white lab coat carried a weight that local law enforcement might hesitate to crush. They were there to bridge the gap between healthcare and justice, documenting the wounds that the Alabama sun sought to hide. In 1965, Selma, the statistics were as stark as the black and white newsreels. While half the city's population was black, only 1 to 2% of eligible black residents were actually registered to vote. The path to the ballot box was intentionally blocked by a Byzantine maze of literacy tests and voter vouchers designed to keep the levers of power firmly in the hands of the white minority. To the volunteer nurses arriving from New York, Chicago, and neighboring counties, these political barriers they saw the systemic disenfranchisement reflected in the bodies of their patients, the toll of long-term poverty, the lack of preventative care in a segregated society, and now the fresh, jagged trauma of the baton and the boot. The triage center, established within the pews of Brown Chapel, became a microcosm of the integrated work. Here, black and white doctors and nurses worked side by side, an act of profound defiance in a state where such cooperation was often viewed as a criminal provocation. They meticulously prepared medical kits filled with gauze, saline for flushing eyes blinded by CN and CS gas, and basic splints, all while the shadow of Sheriff Jim Clark's posse loomed just beyond the church doors. The MCHR volunteers knew their presence served as a deterrent. They were the professional vanguard, betting that the presence of educated, often northern-based physicians would force a degree of Every bandage applied was a political act, and every recorded injury was a piece of evidence for a nation that could no longer look away. On the morning of March 21st, 1965, the pavement of U.S. Highway 80 stretched out like a ribbon of heat and uncertainty. This was the Jefferson Davis Highway, a name that served as a constant, bitter reminder of the soil's history. But for the 82% of the marchers who were black, it was now the Freedom Road. As the procession of 3,200 souls began their 54-mile exodus from Selma, they were flanked by a peculiar sight. A fleet of private sedans and station wagons, many bearing hand-painted Red Cross symbols or taped-on MCHR placards. These were the medical caravans, the mobile life support of a movement. Dr. Alvin Poussin, the MCHR Southern Field Director, patrolled the line in a vehicle stocked with more than just bandages. He carried the weight of knowing that at any moment, the piece could shatter into the kind of trauma witnessed at the bridge just 2 weeks prior. For the volunteer nurses like June Dobbs Butts, the mission was no longer just about survival in a crisis, but endurance over. The Alabama sun was a relentless adversary, but the physical toll of the march went far deeper than skin-reddening heat. As the miles accumulated, the medical tents, often nothing more than canvas flaps pitched in muddy fields, became sanctuaries of quiet desperation. Each night, as the marchers collapsed into their bedrolls in the damp Lowndes County air, the nurses began their real work. They moved from person to person, treating a plague of blisters so severe they looked like chemical burns. They used specialized medical kits containing saline solutions to continue flushing the eyes of those still suffering from the lingering effects of CN and CS tear gas, which had caused weeping sores. The nurses' hands, many of which belonged to women who had traveled from prestigious hospitals in the North, were now stained with the red clay of Alabama as they applied zinc oxide and moleskin to the feet of elderly sharecroppers and young students alike. They were managing a humanitarian crisis on the move, treating heat exhaustion and dehydration with a measured professional calm. But the most shocking part of this story hasn't even begun. Beyond the physical ailments, these medical volunteers, the presence of a nurse in a crisp white uniform or a doctor with a stethoscope around his neck acted as a visual deterrent to the hostile crowds that lined the highway. These professionals were the medical presence, a silent witness to the world that these marchers were not just protesters, but human beings whose lives were being guarded by the highest. Every saline wash and every wrapped ankle was a clinical act of rebellion against a system that had long dismissed the health and humanity of those walking toward Montgomery. When the supplies of gauze ran low and the temperature dipped into the shivering 40s at night, the doctors and nurses stayed awake, patrolling the perimeter of the camps, ensuring that the 50 healers on the highway, they were the bridge. The atmosphere in Selma during that third week of March 1965 was a heavy, suffocating blend of profound grief and a newly forged, steel-ribbed resolve. The losses of February and early March had been devastating. First, the young deacon and veteran Jimmy Lee Jackson had succumbed to his wounds after being shot by a state trooper in Marion, and then the white minister James Reeb had been beaten into. But these tragedies had finally forced the hand of the White House. On March 15th, President Lyndon B. Johnson had stood before a joint session of Congress to deliver the American Promise, a speech that resonated through the medical triage units at Brown Chapel A.M.E. Church like a benediction. When he uttered the words, "And we shall overcome," the volunteer nurses working in the shadows of the sanctuary knew the tide had finally turned. On the morning of March 21st, the world watched as a transformation took place on the dusty streets of Selma. Under a federal court order and the direct command of the president, a massive shield of federal protection descended upon the movement. The Alabama National Guard, 1,900 men who had previously been the instruments of Governor George Wallace's segregationist will were federalized and ordered to protect the very people they had once been commanded to suppress. They were joined by 2,000 U.S. Army soldiers, 100 FBI agents, and a fleet of helicopters circling overhead like protective hawks. But the most shocking part of this story hasn't even begun. As the 3,200 marchers began their 54-mile journey across the crest of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Highway 80, the volunteer medical teams from the Medical Committee for Human Rights found themselves navigating a logistical feat that resembled the nurses. Women like June Dobbs Butts, with her steady hands and focused gaze, moved among the crowd, their white uniforms and Red Cross armbands serving as a sharp clinical contrast against the red dust of the Alabama road and the olive drab of the soldiers' fatigues. Dr. John L.S. Holloman Jr. and Dr. Alvin Poussin, both prominent black physicians from the North, coordinated what they called medical caravans. These were a mobile network of private cars and repurposed ambulances, each marked prominently to ensure they could. The route, known then as the Jefferson-Davis Highway, was a gauntlet of psychological and physical endurance. While the federal soldiers stood with bayonets fixed every 50 yards, their eyes scanning the dense thickets of the swampy Lowndes County terrain for snipers or Klansmen, the nurses focused on the human cost of the miles. The environment was brutal. The Alabama sun beat down on the 54-mile stretch of asphalt, and the medical volunteers treated thousands of cases of severe blisters, heat exhaustion, and the lingering respiratory distress caused by the chemical residue. In this strange, militarized sanctuary, the medical volunteers saw a vision of what the country could be, a place where the law finally stood between the vulnerable and the violent. As night fell and the marchers huddled in the muddy fields of supportive black farmers, the nurses worked by the flickering light of kerosene lamps to lance infections and wrap weary feet. They were the silent guardians of a moving city that stretched for miles, ensuring that the marchers did not just walk, but survive the journey to the heart of the Deep South's capital. Despite the looming threat of night riders reported by the FBI, the presence of the MCHR doctors and nurses offered a promise that no marcher would be left behind on that long, sun-scorched road to Montgomery. History has more secrets to reveal. Subscribe and hit the bell to share this with someone who loves history. The dust had barely settled on the sun-baked pavement of the Jefferson-Davis Highway when the medical reports began to transform from urgent triage notes into a powerful testimony for the soul of a nation. For the volunteer nurses and the physicians of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, the 54-mile trek was far more than a logistical triumph. It was as the 25,000 marchers finally gathered at the Alabama state capitol on March 25, 1965, the MCHR volunteers were already documenting the results of the medical presence they had established. This presence proved to the world that healthcare was, in itself, a fundamental civil right. The wounds they had treated at Brown Chapel A.M.E. Church, from the bone fractures of Bloody Sunday to the chemical burns from tear gas, became the primary evidence that could no longer be ignored by the halls. The momentum generated on that long, exhausting road reached its legislative zenith only months later on August 6, 1965. President Lyndon B. Johnson, standing in the very same room where Abraham Lincoln had once signed a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, put his pen to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This landmark legislation finally outlawed the discriminatory literacy tests and voter vouchers that had held Selma's black residents in a grip of near-total disenfranchisement. In a city where half the population was black, yet only 1 to 2% were registered to vote, the law changed the landscape of American democracy overnight. But the legacy of Selma's the detailed accounts provided by Dr. John L.S. Holloman Jr. and Dr. Alvin Poussin helped catalyze the broader medical civil rights movement. Their work forced the mandatory and rapid desegregation of hospitals across the American South. These facilities, which had often remained segregated despite the Civil Rights Act of 1964, were finally integrated as federal funding became strictly tied to the equitable treatment of every patient. The nurses, including figures like June Dobbs Butts, who provided both physical and psychological support, and the local Selma residents who acted as triage assistants, left behind a blueprint for humanitarian activism. They proved that a stethoscope and a roll of gauze could be as effective as a protest sign when held with conviction. Today, the Edmund Pettus Bridge stands as a silent sentinel over the Alabama River, and in 1996, the path the marchers trod was officially designated the Selma to Montgomery National Historic Trail. Yet, for many who lived through those 5 days in March, the true monument is not made of steel or stone, but of the lives saved and the dignity restored in the face of state-sponsored violence. The volunteer nurse, with her saline eye washes for tear gas and her bandages for the blisters of 1,000-person miles, represent the road from Selma was long, and the scars, both physical and societal, remained for generations. Yet the prescription for justice had finally been written in the blood, sweat, and unyielding courage of those who refused to turn back. History has more secrets to reveal. Subscribe and hit the bell. Share this with someone who loves history.